You stand in what remains of a building that has stood for 200 years, stood through empires and revolutions and wars that tried to erase it from existence. And now it is coming down, not from bombs or fire, but from time, from the simple mathematics of entropy, from the weight of decades pressing down on stone and mortar until even the strongest foundations begin to crack, begin to whisper their surrender. And you are part of the crew hired to clear the rubble, to make space for something new, something glass and steel that will have no memory of what came before. And your hands are rough from this work, from lifting broken bricks and twisted metal, from sorting through the debris of lives you never knew, and the dust coats everything, settles in your lungs and on your skin like a second layer, like the residue of forgotten stories. And it is Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday in October, when the air smells of autumn and decay, when the light slants through the broken walls in shafts that illuminate particles dancing like snow. And you are alone in what used to be the third floor, in a room whose purpose has been erased by time, and you pry loose a section of wall that crumbles at your touch, that releases a cloud of plaster dust so thick you have to stop and cough and wait for it to settle. And when it does, you see something, just a corner of paper, yellowed and fragile, wedged between two boards in a space so narrow you wonder how anything survived there, how this scrap of the past escaped the fires that scarred these walls in 1945, escaped the water damage and the rot and the decades of neglect, and you reach for it carefully because your grandfather taught you to respect old things, taught you that everything has a story, even if that story has been forgotten. And the paper resists at first, clings to its hiding place, as if it knows that emergence means vulnerability, means exposure to a world that has moved on without it. But you are patient. You work it free slowly, and when it finally comes loose, you hold in your hands an envelope, brittle as autumn leaves, stained with watermarks that have bloomed across its surface like strange flowers. And the handwriting on the front is elegant, is the careful script of someone who learned to write with fountain pens and proper instruction, someone for whom letters were not casual things, but ceremonies. And you can make out a name, Anna Bergman, and an address on this very street, number 47, and the envelope is sealed still, was never opened, never reached its destination. And you should probably throw it away, should toss it onto the pile with all the other detritus of demolished buildings, with the broken tiles and shattered glass and fragments of lives that no one claims anymore. But something stops you, some instinct that whispers that this matters, that 70 years of waiting deserves more than a burial in a landfill. And you slip the envelope into your jacket, and you finish your shift. And that evening, in your small apartment, you sit at your kitchen table under the fluorescent light that hums like a trapped insect, and you open the envelope with hands that tremble slightly, because you understand you are transgressing, are reading words meant for someone else, are stepping into a moment that was supposed to be private. And inside is a single sheet of paper, covered in that same elegant script, and you begin to read, and the words pull you backward through time, pull you into January 1945, into a city that is burning, into a moment when the world is tearing itself apart, and all that remains is the desperate human need to say goodbye, to leave some mark, to whisper into the void that you existed, that you loved, that your life meant something.
You read the words, and they are in German, a language you understand only partially because your grandmother spoke it sometimes in her kitchen when she thought no one was listening, when she would stare out the window and murmur phrases that sounded like prayers or regrets. And you piece together the meaning slowly, like assembling a puzzle with half the pieces missing. And the letter begins, Meine liebste Anna, my dearest Anna. And already you feel the weight of intimacy, the sense that you are intruding on something sacred. And the handwriting is steady at first, but becomes more hurried as it progresses, as if the writer knew time was running out, knew that every second spent forming letters was a second borrowed from fate. And you read that the writer's name is Friedrich, that he is writing from a cellar while the city shakes above him, while the sound of artillery grows closer, like approaching thunder. And he writes that he has tried to reach her, has tried 3 times to cross the city to the address where she is staying with her sister, but the streets are impassable, are rivers of rubble and fire, are patrolled by soldiers who shoot first and ask questions never. And he writes that he loves her, has loved her since they were 17 and she wore a blue dress to the summer festival and laughed at his awkward attempt to ask her to dance. And he writes that he is sorry, so sorry for all the arguments that seemed important but were not, for the time he spent working when he should have been holding her, for every moment wasted on things that do not matter when the world is ending. And he writes that he has hidden this letter in the wall of their apartment, the apartment they shared for 3 years before the war made everything impossible, before he was conscripted and she was evacuated, and their life together became a memory they tried to preserve, like flowers pressed between pages. And he writes that if he does not survive, if the morning comes and he is not there to retrieve this letter, then perhaps someday, somehow it will find its way to her, will tell her that his last thoughts were of her, that he died with her name on his lips, that whatever comes after death, if anything comes, he will be waiting. And you sit back in your chair, and the letter trembles in your hands, trembles because your hands are shaking, because you have stumbled into the most private chamber of someone's heart, because this Friedrich poured his soul onto this page 70 years ago and believed, had to believe, that love could transcend walls and time and the machinery of war. And you look at the envelope again, at the address, and you wonder about Anna, wonder if she survived the war, if she waited for Friedrich, if she spent years wondering what happened to him, if she married someone else or grew old alone, if she is even still alive. And you know you should let this go, should accept that some stories have no endings, that the past is a country you cannot visit, but you cannot. You are gripped by a need you do not fully understand, a need to honor this act of love, to complete the delivery that was interrupted 70 decades ago. And you begin to search, begin with the city records that have been digitized, with the archives that document who lived where and when. And you find Anna Berggren listed at number 47 from 1942 to 1946, and then the trail goes cold, goes silent. And you search deeper, through marriage records and death certificates and immigration documents, through the scattered paper trail that people leave behind as they move through the world. And you find a marriage record from 1947, Anna Bergman married to Klaus Hoffmann, and you feel something sink in your chest, feel the weight of reality crushing the romantic hope that she waited, that she never gave up. But then you understand that 1947 was 2 years after the war ended, 2 years of not knowing, 2 years of waiting for a man who never came home. And who could blame her for choosing life over endless grief, for accepting the comfort of another's arms when the alternative was drowning in sorrow? And you find her death certificate, Anna Hoffmann, née Bergman, died 2003, and your heart sinks further because she is gone, because you are too late, because this letter will never reach the hands it was meant for. But you keep searching because the need has become obsession, has become the thing that fills your evenings, and you find the children, 2 daughters born in 1948 and 1951, and you find their names and you search for them.
You find them living in different cities now, scattered like seeds carried by wind, one daughter in Munich and the other in Hamburg. And you spend 3 days composing an email that feels impossible to write, trying to explain who you are, a construction worker who found something in a wall, trying to convince you you are not insane or cruel, not someone playing an elaborate hoax, trying to convey the weight of what you hold in your hands, this fragile bridge between their mother's past and their present. And you attach photographs of the letter, of the envelope, of the handwriting that their mother might have recognized, and you press send before you can reconsider, before doubt can paralyze you. And then you wait, and the waiting is terrible, is filled with the possibility that they will ignore you, will delete your message as spam, will think you are trying to scam them or hurt them. And 3 days pass like 3 years. And then your phone rings, and the voice on the other end is a woman's voice, shaking, speaking German so rapid you can barely follow. And she switches to English when she realizes you are struggling, and she says her name is Margarita, says she is Anna's younger daughter, says she received your email and she does not understand, cannot understand, because her mother never spoke of a Friedrich, never mentioned anyone before her father. And you tell her everything. Tell her about the building and the wall and the letter that waited 70 years in darkness. And there is silence on the line. Silence so long you think the call has dropped. And then you hear crying, quiet sobbing that she tries to muffle. And she says, "Can I see it? Please, I need to see it." And you arrange to meet, and you take a train to Munich, take a day off work that you cannot really afford, and you meet her in a cafe that smells of coffee and pastries, and she is 63 years old with gray hair and her mother's eyes, or what you imagine were her mother's eyes, and her hands shake when you give her the envelope, when she holds this artifact from a life her mother kept hidden. And she opens it with a care that borders on reverence, and she reads, and tears run down her face and drip onto the table, and she says, "My mother kept a box, a small wooden box that we found after she died, and in it was a blue dress, very old, moth-eaten, and a dance card from 1937, and a photograph of a young man we did not recognize. And we asked our father about it, and he said only that your mother had a life before me, and we must respect that. And we never pushed, never demanded to know, because our father was a good man who understood that the heart has rooms we cannot enter. And now I understand. Now I see that she carried this Friedrich with her always, carried him in that box, in that secret chamber, and she never knew what happened to him, never knew that he wrote this letter, that his last act was reaching toward her across the burning city. And Margarita tells you more, tells you that her mother was kind, but always carried a sadness, a weight that seemed to have no source, that she would sometimes stand at the window in winter and stare out at the snow, and her face would crumple just slightly, would show a grief so old it had become part of her bones. And she tells you that her mother spoke once, only once, about the war, said that in war you lose more than you can ever explain, that the dead take pieces of you with them. And you sit together in this cafe, and you are strangers bound by a letter, by the strange alchemy of chance that put this paper in your hands. And Margarita asks if you will help her find out what happened to Friedrich, if you will help her complete her mother's story. And you say yes, say it without hesitation, because you are already entangled in this narrative, already invested in bringing closure to a love that survived everything except time. And together you search the military records, the casualty lists, the endless documentation of death that the war produced, and you find him, Friedrich Adler, conscripted 1943, reported missing January 1945, presumed dead, and the address listed is the same address where you found the letter. And you understand that he never made it out of that building, that he died, perhaps, in the cellar where he wrote those words, that the city fell on him like all cities eventually fall. And Margarita weeps, weeps for a man she never knew who loved her mother with a purity that feels almost unbearable. You sit with Marguerite in the silence that follows grief, in the heavy quiet that settles over revelations that change everything and nothing. Because Friedrich has been dead for 70 years, but only now does his death become real, becomes witnessed, becomes mourned by someone who carries his beloved's blood. And she tells you she needs to tell her sister, needs to share this with the only other person who might understand what it means to discover that your mother's sadness had a name, had a face, had a story that was beautiful and terrible. And 2 weeks later you meet again, this time all three of you, Marguerite and her older sister Helena, who is 65 and has their mother's elegant hands. And Helena brings the box, the wooden box that sat in their mother's closet for decades. And she opens it on the table between you, and inside is the blue dress folded with care that suggests ceremony, and the photograph of a young man with dark hair and eyes that seem to look past the camera towards something distant, something hopeful. And you recognize those eyes, even though you have never seen this face before. Recognize them from the handwriting, from the love that poured through the letters on the page. And there is a dance card with Friedrich's name written 3 times in a girl's hopeful script. And there is a pressed flower, so old it has become transparent, become a ghost of itself. And Helena says our mother kept this box locked, kept the key on a chain around her neck even when she slept. And when she was dying, when the cancer had taken everything but her breath, she held that key and she whispered a name we could not quite hear. And we thought she was calling for our father. But now I wonder, now I know she was calling for him, for this Friedrich who wrote her a letter that never arrived, who died loving her while she lived not knowing. And you tell them about the building, about how it burned in the final days of the war, about how the records show that 17 people died in the cellar when it collapsed. 17 souls who huddled together while the world ended above them. And Friedrich was among them, was buried in a mass grave in the city cemetery, in a section reserved for the unidentified, for those whose deaths were so chaotic that names were lost. And the sisters decide they want to see it, want to visit the place where he rests, and you go with them because you are part of this now, because you picked up an envelope and it picked you up in return. And you stand together in the cemetery where rows of simple markers stretch like soldiers at attention, where the names have been replaced by numbers, by the bureaucratic cataloging of mass death. And Marguerite places flowers on the grave that might be his, that probably is his, that contains him and 16 others who also had mothers and lovers and dreams. And she reads the letter aloud, reads it in German, while you and Helena stand witness, and her voice cracks on the words, Meine Liebste Anna. And you understand that this is a funeral 70 years late, is the completion of a ritual that was interrupted by fire and rubble and the chaos of a continent tearing itself apart. And when she finishes reading, there is silence. And then Helena speaks, says, our mother loved our father, loved him truly, but there was always a room in her heart he could not enter, a space reserved for the boy who danced with her in a blue dress, who made her laugh, who promised her a future that the war devoured. And she says, I am grateful, grateful that you found this letter, grateful that we know now
that we can tell our children and our grandchildren that love is the thing that survives, that even when everything else is destroyed, even when cities burn and empires fall and millions die, the human heart continues to reach across the void, continues to whisper, "I love you," into the darkness. And they ask if they can keep the letter, and you say, of course, say it was never yours, you were only the messenger, only the instrument of delivery. And Marguerite embraces you, holds you tight like you are family, like you are connected by something deeper than blood. And she says, you have given us a gift, have given us the missing piece of our mother's puzzle. And now, when we remember her sadness, we can hold it gently, can understand it not as weakness, but as the price of loving deeply, of losing someone so completely that even joy becomes bittersweet. And you ride the train home, and you think about your own life, about the woman you almost married but did not, about the job you meant to take but turned down, about all the letters you never wrote, never sent, all the words you swallowed because timing was wrong or courage failed.
You return to your apartment and it feels different now. Feels smaller and larger simultaneously, as if the walls have absorbed what you have learned, as if the air itself carries the weight of Friedrich's words and Anna's waiting and the 70 years that separated intention from delivery. And you sit at your kitchen table where you first opened that envelope, where you first read words meant for a woman who died not knowing they existed, and you understand something fundamental has shifted inside you, something about how you move through the world, about what you pay attention to. And you think about all the letters that never get sent, all the words that die in throats or on tongues or in hearts too afraid to speak. And you think about your own father who died 3 years ago, who you argued with in those final months about things that seemed important then but dissolve now into insignificance, about whose stubbornness was greater, about old wounds that you insisted on keeping fresh, and you never told him that you forgave him, never said the words that might have eased his passing, never wrote the letter that Friedrich wrote, never gave him the chance to know that despite everything, despite the failures and disappointments that mark every father-son relationship, you loved him. And that silence sits in you now like a stone, like something that cannot be dissolved or dislodged. And you pull out paper, actual paper, because this demands physicality, demands the weight of pen on fiber. And you begin to write to people you have wronged or neglected, to your sister who you have not spoken to in 2 years over a dispute so petty you can barely remember its origin, to your best friend from childhood who moved away and whose emails you stopped answering because life got busy and busy became an excuse, to the woman you almost married, the one whose heart you broke because you were too afraid of commitment, too convinced that there would always be more time, more chances, more tomorrows. And you write not because you expect forgiveness, not because you think words on paper can undo years of absence or repair what you have broken, but because Friedrich taught you that silence is the cruelest choice, that the letter unwritten is the regret that calcifies into permanent grief. And you write through the night, write until your hand cramps and dawn begins to pale the windows. And you mail these letters, actually walk to the post office and hand them to the clerk and watch them disappear into the system, into the machinery that will carry them to destinations you can only hope they reach. And weeks pass, and some letters receive responses and some do not. And your sister calls, and her voice is cautious at first, but then breaks open into tears, into "I missed you," into "why did we let this happen?" and you talk for 3 hours, talk about your father and your childhoods and the strange ways families wound each other while meaning to love. And she tells you she has a daughter now, your niece who you have never met, and you arrange to visit, to be part of her life again, to not let any more time vanish into the void between intention and action. And the woman you almost married writes back a single line, "I forgive you, and I hope you have forgiven yourself." And you realize you have not, have spent years carrying guilt like a backpack full of stones, and her words do not erase that weight, but they shift it somehow, make it possible to imagine setting it down. And you think about Anna Bergman, who became Anna Hoffman, who chose to continue living even though the love of her youth was lost, who raised daughters and kept a blue dress in a box and survived. And you understand that survival is not betrayal, that moving forward is not the same as forgetting, that the heart is large enough to hold both grief and joy, both memory and new love. And you return to the building site, to the demolition work, but you move through it differently now. You pause when you find objects in the rubble. You examine the detritus with reverence. You wonder about the hands that touched these things, the lives that unfolded in these rooms. And your co-workers think you have gone strange, have become too contemplative for a man whose job is destruction. But you do not care, because you understand that even in breaking down, you can honor what was. Even in clearing away the past, you can witness it. And months later, you receive an invitation, thick paper with formal script, and it is from Marguerite and Helena, and they are unveiling a memorial stone in the cemetery, a proper marker for Friedrich and the 16 others who died in that cellar. And the stone will bear all their names, recovered through painstaking research, through cross-referencing records and dental charts and the fragmentary evidence that survived the chaos. And you attend the ceremony, and there are perhaps 30 people gathered, children and grandchildren of the dead, people who never knew these souls but carry their blood. And a priest speaks about memory, about the duty of the living to witness the dead, about how love transcends the grave, not through mysticism, but through the simple act of remembering. And Marguerite speaks, and she tells the story of the letter, tells it beautifully, tells how a construction worker became a messenger across time, and people turn to look at you, and you feel exposed and humbled. And afterward an old man approaches you, must be 90 if he is a day, and he grips your hand with surprising strength, and he says, "I knew Friedrich, we were boys together, and when the war came we lost touch, and I thought of him sometimes over the years, wondered what happened, and now I know, and I can close that chapter, can stop wondering." And you realize that this letter, this scrap of paper that survived against all odds, has created ripples that extend far beyond Anna, far beyond her daughters, has touched dozens of lives, has completed dozens of stories. And you understand, finally, what you were meant to learn, that we are all connected by invisible threads, that the things we do echo in ways we cannot predict, that a letter hidden in a wall can wait 70 years and still change the world, still remind us that love is the architecture that outlasts empires, that survives the collapse of buildings and the death of cities, that persists in blue dresses and pressed flowers and the faithful carrying of boxes whose contents we protect, even when we do not fully understand why. And you go home that evening, and you write one more letter, this one to yourself, to the person you will be in 20 years or 40 years, or however long you are granted. And you write, "Remember this. Remember that you found a letter, and it found you. Remember that every day is a chance to speak the words that matter, to be the messenger, to choose connection over silence, to honor the Friedrichs and Annas of the world by living with the courage to love openly, to forgive freely, to never assume there will be another tomorrow, to say what your heart contains today. And you seal this letter, and you put it in your own box, your own keeping, and you know that whoever finds it, whether you or someone else, will understand that you learned what matters, that you became, through the strange grace of chance and rubble and a wall that kept it secret for 70 years, a witness to the enduring truth that love, only love, is the letter that never fails to reach its destination, even when it takes a lifetime, even when it requires a stranger's hands, even when the world conspires against its delivery. Because love is patient, love is stubborn, love waits in walls until the walls come down, and then, finally, impossibly, miraculously, love finds its home.